Picture a Caribbean island in your mind. Turquoise water, palm trees, cruise ships docking between Jamaica and Puerto Rico. Now forget all of it, because the island this video is about isn't anywhere near there. It sits alone in the North Atlantic, closer to Nova Scotia than to any tropical neighbor, with no other landmass for hundreds of miles in almost every direction. It has no rivers, no lakes, no groundwater fit to drink, and almost no arable soil. It sits directly in the path of some of the most violent hurricanes the Atlantic Ocean produces, year after year, with nothing around it to break the wind. By every reasonable measure of habitability, this should be an empty rock, the kind of place ships root around rather than toward. Instead, it's home to one of the highest concentrations of wealth per person on the entire planet, and it quietly finances a meaningful share of the world's recovery every time a hurricane, an earthquake, or a wildfire destroys someone's home on the other side of the globe. Roughly 64,000 people live here, on a landmass smaller than the island of Manhattan, and yet money moves through this place at a scale that has almost nothing to do with its physical size. This is Bermuda. And the real story here isn't survival. It's how a tiny, resourceless island turned its own worst-case geography into a permanent, deliberately engineered source of global financial power. To understand how a place this small became this consequential, you have to start with a geological accident that has nothing to do with human decisions at all. Bermuda sits at the tip of what geologists call the Bermuda pedestal, the exposed remnant of a massive volcano that formed millions of years ago over a hotspot in the Earth's crust, rising roughly 15,000 feet from the surrounding seafloor before eventually going dormant. Very few places on Earth share this exact geological origin story of an isolated volcanic seamount rising from open ocean floor with no surrounding tectonic activity to explain it, which is part of why Bermuda's very existence as dry land is somewhat anomalous compared to island chains formed along active plate boundaries elsewhere in the world. As the volcano cooled and began sinking back beneath the waves over a span of millions of years, something unrelated to the volcanic activity itself took over. Colonies of coral began building reefs around the rim of the submerged caldera, generation after generation, as sea levels rose and fell across successive ice ages. Those reefs were repeatedly exposed during periods of lower sea level, broken down by wind and wave action into sand, and compacted over time into solid limestone, layer after layer, until the accumulated material rose high enough above the waterline to form the island that exists today. What tourists and residents walk on today isn't volcanic rock at all. It's the fossilized remains of an ancient coral reef, sitting on top of a mountain that technically stopped growing millions of years ago. That geology explains why Bermuda exists as land at all, but it also explains the island's most fundamental survival problem. Limestone of this type is highly porous, riddled with tiny channels and cavities formed as the original coral structure compacted, and a landmass built entirely from it simply cannot hold fresh water the way a normal continental landscape does. There are no rivers here, because there's no impermeable rock layer to channel water into a streambed. There are no natural lakes of any meaningful size. There is no usable groundwater aquifer, because rain filters straight through the porous limestone and mixes with salt water intruding from beneath the island almost immediately after it falls. For any developing society trying to establish itself here, this represents about as severe a resource deficit as a landmass can have. No reliable source of the single resource every human settlement depends on before anything else. Not agriculture, not trade, not shelter. Bermuda's isolation compounds this problem in a way few other islands on Earth experience. The nearest landmass isn't a neighboring island in some sheltering archipelago, the way most oceanic islands exist as part of a chain, sharing weather patterns, trade routes, and mutual protection with their neighbors. It's the coast of North Carolina, roughly 1,000 kilometers to the west, across open Atlantic water with nothing in between. Sail directly east from Bermuda, and the next land you'd reach is the coast of Morocco, thousands of kilometers away across entirely open ocean. There is no chain of neighboring islands to trade with, no larger landmass to blunt an incoming storm, no regional network of any kind that a typical island economy might rely on for supplies, trade partners, or mutual defense in the way islands throughout the Caribbean or the Pacific historically could. Bermuda sits by itself in open water, a single exposed point with nothing around it to share the risk or the burden of isolation, a genuinely unusual geographic condition for a landmass this size to occupy anywhere on Earth. And the same ocean currents that make the island habitable at all are precisely what expose it to its greatest danger. Bermuda lies within the Sargasso Sea, the only sea on Earth defined not by coastlines, but entirely by converging ocean currents forming a massive, slow-rotating gyre, and its climate is shaped almost entirely by the Gulf Stream, a warm current that flows past the island despite its latitude sitting well north of the tropics where such warmth would normally be expected. That warm water is what allows coral to survive this far north in the first place, and it's what gives Bermuda a climate closer to the Caribbean than to its actual geographic neighbors along the North American coast at a similar latitude. But warm ocean water is also the fuel that powers Atlantic hurricanes, and Bermuda's position places it directly along the path storms take as they move north from the Caribbean and up the U.S. eastern seaboard, gathering strength over exactly the warm water that makes the island's own climate so temperate. With no mountains to disrupt wind patterns and no surrounding landmass to absorb storm surge before it reaches the shore, the island takes the full, unbuffered force of nearly every major hurricane that passes anywhere near it, repeatedly, every single season, decade after decade. Taken together, this is about as difficult a starting position as a piece of habitable land can have. No fresh water, no natural resources to build an economy on, total isolation from any support network, and a geographic bullseye for the most destructive storms the Atlantic produces. For millions of years, that combination did exactly what you'd expect. Nobody came here at all. When the Spanish sea captain Juan de Bermudez first recorded sighting the island in 1505, he found something that set it apart from almost every other landmass European explorers encountered in this era. Nothing. No indigenous population, no prior human settlement of any kind, unlike the thriving indigenous civilizations Spanish and other European expeditions were encountering throughout the Caribbean during the same period. Bermuda's extreme isolation had kept it entirely unreached by human beings for its entire existence, a genuine blank slate at a moment in history when almost every other habitable landmass on Earth already carried some prior human history. The Spanish had no interest in changing that. Ships attempting to approach the island were frequently torn apart on the treacherous coral reefs ringing its coastline, hidden just beneath the surface of otherwise calm-looking water, a hazard that would continue wrecking vessels for centuries afterward. Sailors who survived long enough to hear the island at night reported strange, shrieking sounds coming from the forest, which led Spanish mariners to name it the Isle of Devils and avoid it deliberately for the following century, passing the reputation along to other European sailors through word of mouth across the Atlantic trading world. The sounds, as later generations would eventually determine through simple naturalist observation, came from the mating calls of a native seabird called the cahao, combined with the grunting of feral pigs left behind by earlier shipwrecked vessels. An entirely mundane biological explanation for what sailors at the time took to be genuine supernatural warning against setting foot on the island at all. It took an actual disaster, rather than any deliberate decision, to finally put people on the island permanently. In 1609, an English ship called the Sea Venture was sailing toward the young colony of Jamestown, Virginia, carrying settlers, supplies, and the newly appointed governor of that colony, when it was caught in a severe hurricane in open ocean and began taking on water faster than the crew could manage to pump it out. Facing the near certainty of sinking in deep water with no hope of rescue, the ship's admiral, Sir George Somers, deliberately steered the vessel onto Bermuda's reefs rather than let it go down in deep water, a calculated decision that saved the lives of all 150 people aboard, wedging the ship firmly enough on the corral to allow an orderly evacuation. The survivors spent the following 10 months on the island, using surviving wreckage and the island's native cedar timber to construct 2 entirely new vessels capable of completing the remaining journey to Jamestown. News of the wreck traveled back to London through published survivor accounts, and those accounts reportedly reached the desk of at least one playwright who found the material irresistible. Many literary historians believe William Shakespeare drew directly on published narratives of the Sea Venture disaster while writing The Tempest, a play centered on a shipwreck on an enchanted, isolated island, first performed only a few years after the actual wreck occurred. Whether or not that specific literary connection is fully certain, the fact that a single hurricane off a remote, previously unpopulated island could plausibly have shaped one of the most performed plays in the English language says something about how genuinely remarkable this accidental colonization event was considered at the time, even before anyone understood what the island would eventually become financially. What happened during those 10 months mattered more to Bermuda's future than the eventual rescue itself. Far from confirming the old reputation of a cursed, uninhabitable rock, the island struck the stranded colonists as genuinely hospitable terrain, abundant in wild hogs, fish, and native birds, once you understood how to work with what it actually offered. A small number of the survivors chose to remain behind rather than continue on to the considerably harsher conditions awaiting colonists in Virginia, effectively founding a permanent settlement almost by accident. And by 1612, the English crown had formally chartered Bermuda as a colony, extending its jurisdiction to a landmass that had been avoided as cursed territory for the entire previous century, based on nothing more than misidentified bird calls and a well-earned reputation for shipwrecks. Formal colonization solved the question of legal claim, but it did nothing to solve Bermuda's fundamental resource problem. The absence of fresh water hadn't gone away simply because English settlers had arrived, and any permanent population would need to actually solve it, not simply endure it, to survive here at all beyond the first few desperate seasons. Their solution turned out to be a piece of purely architectural engineering, and it remains visible on almost every rooftop across the island today. Colonists began carving roofs directly from local limestone, arranging the surface in a distinctive step terrace pattern and coating it in white lime wash, both to reflect the intense subtropical sun and to help purify collected rainwater as it ran across the surface toward collection points. Rain falling on these stepped roofs slows as it moves down the terraces, allowing sediment and airborne salt to settle out before the water is funneled into large underground cisterns built beneath nearly every home on the island. That system proved so effective and so essential to survival on an island with zero natural fresh water of its own that it remains written directly into Bermuda's building code today. Every structure on the island is still legally required to capture and store its own rainwater, using fundamentally the same method those first colonists devised out of pure necessity more than 4 centuries ago, with no meaningful alternative ever having been required since. The early colonists initially tried the same approach that was proving profitable throughout England's other American colonies at the time, attempting to grow tobacco as a cash crop for export back to Europe, following the same model that was rapidly enriching planters just a few hundred miles away in Virginia. It failed quickly and decisively. Bermuda's limestone soil is shallow, poor in nutrients, and spread across a landmass simply too small to compete at any meaningful scale with the vast plantations economies developing in Virginia and across the Caribbean during the same period, where deeper, richer soil and considerably more available acreage gave planters an advantage Bermuda's geology could never realistically match. Agriculture, in the conventional sense, was never going to be a viable foundation for this particular colony's economy, regardless of how much effort settlers put into it or how many seasons they persisted before finally abandoning the attempt. So Bermuda pivoted toward the one resource its geography had actually given it in abundance: the surrounding ocean itself. Bermuda cedar, a native tree remarkably well suited to shipbuilding, allowed colonists to construct vessels that gained a regional reputation for speed and maneuverability, prized specifically for their ability to outrun larger, slower warships and merchant vessels alike in the open Atlantic. Bermudian shipwrights and sailors built a maritime economy around exactly those advantages, exporting both finished vessels and the specialized shipbuilding expertise itself to other British colonies throughout the Americas. The colony became a significant regional producer in the salt trade as well, harvesting salt from shallow coastal pans on nearby Turks Islands and shipping it throughout the wider Atlantic trading network, a business Bermudian sailors came to dominate through sheer familiarity with the specific currents and shoals involved. It's worth noting honestly, as any serious account of this period should, that Bermuda's colonial economy during these centuries depended in part on enslaved labor, a practice common throughout British Atlantic colonies of the era, and one that remained in place until Britain abolished slavery throughout its empire in 1834, a history the island itself has continued to publicly reckon with in recent decades. And, perhaps most tellingly for understanding the character this island would eventually develop, Bermudians turned to privateering, state-sanctioned raiding of enemy shipping during Britain's various wars with rival European powers, a practice that was, in essence, legally licensed piracy conducted under royal authorization and a formal letter of marque. For a meaningful stretch of Bermuda's early colonial history, this combination of shipbuilding, salt, and privateering constituted the actual economic backbone of the colony, allowing it to sustain a population far beyond what its own limestone soil could ever have supported directly, and establishing early on a pattern that would recur throughout Bermuda's history, turning a lack of conventional resources into a specialized, high-risk service the rest of the Atlantic world needed and would pay handsomely for. That economic model, however, was built on a historical moment that was never going to last indefinitely. As the age of sail gave way to steam power through the 19th century, rendering Bermuda's celebrated cedar shipbuilding industry commercially obsolete almost overnight, and as the international legal environment around privateering shifted decisively against the practice following a series of international agreements curbing state-sponsored raiding, Bermuda's maritime economy lost the specific advantages that had sustained it for generations. The island once again faced the same underlying question its first colonists had confronted in 1612. With no meaningful agriculture and no mineral resources to extract, what does an economy here actually consist of, once the ships and the raiding and the salt trade are no longer enough to sustain a growing population? A brief tourism boom in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, driven largely by wealthy American visitors seeking a nearby subtropical escape reachable by steamship from New York in roughly 2 days, provided some economic relief, drawing figures ranging from industrialists to authors seeking a quieter retreat than the more crowded Caribbean destinations already popular at the time. But tourism alone was never going to generate the kind of durable, high-value economy a modern population would eventually require, since tourist spending, however welcome, remained fundamentally seasonal, vulnerable to global economic downturns, and incapable of producing anything close to the concentrated wealth a truly specialized financial industry could generate instead. The answer that eventually emerged wouldn't come from the ocean at all, at least not directly. It would come from a decision about how Bermuda chose to govern itself, a choice that turned out to matter far more to the island's long-term economic fate than any natural resource, any shipbuilding tradition, or any tourist season ever could have. To understand what actually built modern Bermuda's wealth, you have to look past geography entirely and examine something considerably less visible: the specific, unusual legal relationship this small island maintains with the country that colonized it 4 centuries ago. Bermuda is not an independent nation, despite having its own flag, its own currency pegged to the US dollar, and its own Olympic team competing separately from Great Britain. It remains, formally, a British overseas territory, and in fact, the oldest one in continuous existence anywhere in the world, predating the founding of the United States itself. But the practical substance of that relationship is considerably more unusual than the label suggests. Bermuda governs almost the entirety of its own internal affairs. It maintains its own parliament, one of the oldest continuously operating legislatures on Earth, tracing its origins back to 1620, just 8 years after the island's formal colonization, making it older than the founding of the Mayflower colony at Plymouth by that point in time. Bermudians elect their own premier and write their own domestic laws, covering everything from criminal statutes to financial regulation, with almost no day-to-day interference from London. The United Kingdom's role, in practice, is narrowly confined to 2 specific functions: providing military defense against any external threat, and representing Bermuda in foreign diplomatic affairs on the international stage, where the island's small size would otherwise leave it with little independent leverage of its own. This governing arrangement wasn't designed from the outset with financial services in mind. It evolved over 3 centuries primarily as a practical solution to the difficulty of administering a small, distant colony from London, and only much later did Bermuda's own legislature recognize the specific financial advantage this arrangement made possible. The decision to eliminate corporate income tax entirely wasn't a single dramatic policy announcement either. It developed gradually through the 20th century as Bermuda's parliament repeatedly chose not to introduce the kind of corporate taxation that had become standard practice in most developed economies, a quiet, cumulative policy choice rather than a single deliberate masterstroke, though the eventual effect proved just as consequential as if it had been planned from the very beginning. This particular combination, near total domestic self-governance, paired with the external security guarantee of a major world power, created something considerably more valuable than either element would have been on its own. Because Bermuda's own parliament retained full authority to write its own tax code, the island's government made a deliberate policy decision decades ago to impose no corporate income tax whatsoever on companies incorporated there. That single regulatory choice, combined with the protection and international legitimacy that comes with remaining under the British Crown rather than existing as a fully independent and diplomatically untested nation, created an almost uniquely attractive proposition for global capital. A jurisdiction stable enough to trust, protected militarily by a major power, and yet free to set its own financial rules entirely independent of that power's own tax policy. A company incorporating in Bermuda gets the reputational credibility of operating under British common law and British standard financial regulation, without ever paying a cent of British corporate tax on the profits it books there, an arrangement that would be far harder to construct and far less credible to global markets for an island attempting to offer the same terms as a fully independent, unaffiliated micronation. This is the detail worth sitting with, because it's the actual mechanism behind everything that follows in this story. Bermuda didn't become wealthy because of anything unique about its physical geography. Plenty of small, resource-poor islands exist around the world, without developing anything close to Bermuda's per capita wealth, including several with considerably more hospitable climates and considerably fewer hurricanes to contend with each year. What Bermuda actually built was a specific institutional arrangement, full regulatory autonomy over financial and corporate law, backed by the credibility and security of a major global power, without that power's own tax burden attached to it. It's worth noting that Bermuda wasn't the first jurisdiction to attempt some version of this general model, and it isn't the only one operating today. Other small territories and microstates around the world, including several other British overseas territories in the Caribbean, have pursued broadly similar low-tax, high-autonomy strategies with varying degrees of success. What set Bermuda apart, and what ultimately allowed it to build something considerably more substantial than a generic tax shelter, was the specific decision about what kind of financial business to actually specialize in, rather than simply competing on tax rate alone against dozens of comparable jurisdictions offering roughly the same basic proposition. Once that regulatory arrangement existed, Bermuda's government made a further decision that would define the island's modern identity entirely. Rather than becoming simply one more generic offshore tax haven, competing with dozens of similar jurisdictions around the world purely on low tax rates, Bermuda chose to specialize, building its financial industry around the one subject its own founding history had made it intimately, painfully familiar with: catastrophic natural disaster. The mechanism Bermuda built its modern economy around is called reinsurance, and understanding it requires walking through a concept that sounds dry on paper but functions as one of the genuine load-bearing structures of the global financial system. Reinsurance, in its simplest possible definition, is insurance purchased by insurance companies themselves. Imagine a major hurricane makes landfall along the Florida coast and causes billions of dollars in property damage in a single day. A regional insurance company covering homes in that area might suddenly face tens of thousands of claims arriving simultaneously, all requiring payout at once. If that insurer had to absorb the full cost of every single claim directly, from its own reserves, a disaster of sufficient scale could bankrupt the company entirely, leaving homeowners without the funds needed to rebuild and devastating the local economy in the disaster's aftermath. To prevent exactly that outcome, insurance companies purchase their own coverage, transferring a substantial share of their most catastrophic potential losses to a separate reinsurance company, one that specializes specifically in absorbing risk at this enormous scale, spreading a single region's disaster exposure across a global pool of capital instead of concentrating it entirely within one local balance sheet. Bermuda's entry into this industry wasn't accidental or gradual. It traces to a specific moment. In the mid-1980s, a liability insurance crisis in the United States left many American companies unable to obtain adequate coverage at any reasonable price, and a group of major American corporations responded by pooling their own capital to found a new reinsurance company directly in Bermuda, drawn specifically by the absence of corporate tax and the island's British-based legal framework. That initial venture demonstrated the model could work at scale, and it triggered a wave of similar formations over the following decades, particularly after major catastrophes elsewhere temporarily overwhelmed existing insurance capacity and created fresh demand for new sources of catastrophe capital. Each major disaster, paradoxically, tended to attract more reinsurance capital to Bermuda rather than less, as investors recognized recurring opportunities to provide capacity precisely when the rest of the industry was most stretched. Bermuda, and specifically its capital city of Hamilton, became the global center of gravity for precisely this industry, and the reasons traced directly back to the institutional arrangement described a moment ago. The absence of corporate income tax meant reinsurance companies could retain significantly more capital to actually cover claims, rather than losing a meaningful share of it to taxation before a single policy was ever written. The island's proximity to the United States, home to the highest concentration of expensive coastal real estate anywhere on Earth, and therefore the largest pool of catastrophic property risk needing coverage, made Bermuda a geographically logical hub for ensuring exactly that market, close enough for executives to travel easily, yet entirely outside American tax jurisdiction. And the credibility that comes from operating under British legal and regulatory oversight, rather than in a less established or less trusted offshore jurisdiction with a murkier reputation, gave global insurance companies genuine confidence in placing enormous sums of capital with Bermudian reinsurers, confidence that a jurisdiction with a less credible legal system simply could not have generated at the same scale. Today, when a major hurricane strikes the American coastline, when an earthquake devastates infrastructure in Japan, or when wildfires destroy entire communities in California, it is very often Bermudian reinsurance companies quietly funding a substantial share of the actual reconstruction that follows, writing checks from Hamilton that rebuild homes their own executives may never see in person. Following several recent major American hurricanes, Bermudian reinsurers have reportedly covered roughly 30% of total reconstruction claims. Industry-wide, functioning, in effect, as one of the world's primary financial shock absorbers for large-scale natural catastrophe. What makes this arrangement particularly significant is how it has responded to accelerating climate change in a way that runs directly counter to most people's intuition. As ocean temperatures rise, the same warm water that gives Atlantic hurricanes their destructive power is becoming more energetic and more frequent, producing storms of greater intensity, heavier rainfall, and more severe storm surge than in previous decades, a trend climate scientists have documented with increasing confidence over the past several decades of observational data. A reasonable assumption might be that a company whose entire business model consists of paying out disaster claims would suffer as disasters become more frequent and more severe. In practice, the opposite has occurred. As global catastrophic risk increases, ordinary insurance companies grow more anxious to transfer that risk elsewhere, driving up demand for reinsurance coverage substantially and giving Bermudian firms considerably more pricing power than they held in calmer decades. Because the underlying risk is now measurably higher, Bermudian reinsurers can charge correspondingly higher premiums for the coverage they provide, a direct pass-through of climate risk into their own profitability. These companies employ large teams of climate scientists, meteorologists, and quantitative analysts specifically to build increasingly sophisticated computer models predicting where and how future storms are likely to strike, down to specific coastlines and specific categories of intensity, allowing them to price risk with genuine precision rather than rough estimation the way earlier generations of insurers were forced to. This isn't reckless speculation on future disasters. It's a highly calculated, data-driven wager on the climate itself, one that has, so far, made the island considerably wealthier precisely as the underlying threat it insures against has grown more severe. A genuinely uncomfortable but factually accurate description of how this specific corner of the global economy actually operates. The scale this industry has reached is worth stating plainly. Bermuda-based reinsurance and insurance companies collectively manage hundreds of billions of dollars in capital, an almost incomprehensible sum for an island whose entire resident population would comfortably fit inside a single mid-sized American football stadium. Major global reinsurance firms, some tracing their roots to that original mid-1980s wave of formations, now rank among the largest reinsurers on the planet by capital under management, headquartered in office towers in Hamilton that most of the world will never see in person, quietly processing the financial aftermath of disasters occurring thousands of miles from Bermuda's own shoreline. If you've made it this far with me, thank you, genuinely. This is exactly the kind of story I built this channel to tell. Not the 5-minute headline version, but the slower one, where you actually trace how a specific legal and regulatory choice made decades ago ends up explaining almost everything else about how a place actually works today. If that's what you're after, consider subscribing and joining us. We do this every single day. All right, back to it. Because there's a question worth asking before we leave Bermuda behind. With all of this reinsurance capital flowing through the island, does any of it actually reach the roughly 64,000 people who live there day to day? The answer is genuinely complicated and worth stating plainly rather than glossing over for the sake of a tidy ending. Bermuda's gross domestic product per capita routinely ranks among the very highest of any territory on Earth, frequently exceeding $100,000 per person, a figure driven almost entirely by the enormous volume of reinsurance capital flowing through the island's financial sector, rather than by wages earned in any conventional local industry. The island's infrastructure reflects that wealth directly. Roads are well maintained. The power grid is engineered to recover from hurricane damage with remarkable speed, and public services function at a level most small island nations, and indeed most small American towns, could never sustain on their own without a considerably larger population base to draw tax revenue from. But that same wealth has produced a genuinely difficult contradiction for ordinary residents. Because Bermuda imports essentially everything, every gallon of fuel, every piece of lumber, every vehicle, and nearly all of its food, all shipped or flown in across hundreds of miles of open ocean at considerable expense. The underlying cost of daily life here is extraordinarily high, compounded further by real estate prices driven upward by the wealthy international finance executives. The reinsurance industry has attracted to a 21-square-mile island with strictly limited housing supply and essentially no room to expand. Bermuda has, for years, ranked among the most expensive places to live anywhere on Earth by standard cost of living indices, with grocery prices, housing costs, and basic utilities routinely running several times higher than equivalent costs in a typical American city. Earning a six-figure salary in Bermuda does not make someone comfortably wealthy in any practical sense. In many cases, it barely covers a solidly middle-class standard of living, a genuinely strange outcome for a jurisdiction with one of the highest per capita incomes on the entire planet, and a reminder that aggregate wealth statistics can obscure as much as they reveal about how life actually feels for the people generating them. That contradiction is where this story is actually headed next in this series. Because Bermuda isn't the only place that discovered a vulnerability so severe it should have guaranteed collapse, and instead turned it deliberately into the exact mechanism of its own survival. Here's what stays with me about this story, long after the reinsurance figures and the hurricane statistics fade into the background. Bermuda had, by any conventional measure, almost nothing to work with. No fresh water, no arable soil, no minerals, no neighboring islands to trade with or lean on, and a guaranteed, recurring exposure to some of the most destructive storms the Atlantic Ocean produces year after year, with nothing standing between the island and the full force of the weather. Nearly every advantage a developing economy typically relies on was simply absent here from the very beginning. What Bermuda had instead was a specific kind of institutional freedom, the authority to write its own laws, set its own tax policy, and shape its own financial regulation, all while remaining under the security and international legitimacy of a major world power that never demanded a share of what that autonomy actually produced. That combination, not the coral reefs, not the limestone, not even the stepped roofs that solved the water problem centuries ago, is what actually built the wealth this island holds today. Bermuda looked directly at the disaster that had shipwrecked its own founding colonists 4 centuries earlier, and made a deliberate decision to become the place the rest of the world turns to when that exact kind of disaster strikes somewhere else. Compare that outcome to any number of other small islands scattered across the world's oceans, many of them facing broadly similar constraints of limited land, limited fresh water, and limited natural resources, yet lacking the specific combination of political stability, legal credibility, and regulatory freedom that allowed Bermuda to build something this specialized. The difference was never really about which island happened to draw the worse hand geographically. Several other islands face comparable or even more severe versions of Bermuda's original problems. The difference lay in what each jurisdiction was legally and politically free to do with the hand it was dealt, and how convincingly it could offer that freedom to global capital markets that ultimately had to trust the paperwork as much as the location. That's a different kind of power than the kind this channel usually traces through canals, straits, and mountain tunnels. It isn't about controlling a choke point other nations are physically forced to pass through. It's about recognizing that a small enough, autonomous enough jurisdiction can specialize in absorbing a specific category of risk the rest of the world cannot fully absorb on its own, and building an entire economy around being the place that risk goes to rest. Geography gave Bermuda a curse. Regulatory autonomy turned that same curse into a permanent, load-bearing piece of the global financial system, one that quietly underwrites a meaningful share of disaster recovery anywhere in the world, regardless of whether the people benefiting from that recovery have ever once heard the island's name or could find it correctly on a map if asked. There's something worth sitting with in the fact that Bermuda's founding story and its modern economy are, in the end, the exact same story told twice. In 1609, a hurricane nearly killed 150 English colonists and accidentally founded a nation. 4 centuries later, that same category of storm, scaled up to strike entire coastlines rather than a single ship, has become the foundation of that nation's entire economic identity. The island never stopped living inside the exact disaster that created it. It simply learned, eventually, how to get paid for understanding that disaster better than almost anywhere else on Earth. If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe and share it with 5 people who'd actually sit through something like this. Leave a comment. Tell me honestly what you thought, and tell me what vulnerability you think we should trace next. Because somewhere else on the map, another small, overlooked place has already turned its own worst-case scenario into leverage, and most of the world still hasn't noticed.